Hello everyone. Today we're going to continue with our 3D Studio Max tutorials. So let me go ahead and jump right in. Today's basic animation. In this tutorial we're going to set up some basic keyframes and do a real simple animation and kind of do an introductory session of how to create simple animation, and I'll even show you some different types of tangents for your keyframes. We're going to just be using a simple auto key feature in 3D Studio Max, and by the end of this lesson you should be able to do some simple animation using Max. So for this lesson I'm going to use a simple bouncing ball animation. This is something I always like to start out students with because it's a fairly simple animation, something that everybody can relate to. So I'm going to go ahead and create a plane and put a sphere here in the center. And on this sphere I've set it to base to pivot. If you go to the Modify tab with your sphere selected, look down at the base to pivot checkbox, make sure that's checked, and what that does is it moves this sphere object up so that the pivot point is at the very bottom of that sphere, and that's where we want the contact point to be for this ball to be bouncing on our surface here. So we're going to be keyframing all this animation in, so we'll be simulating the realistic look of a ball bouncing, and we'll also be putting a little bit of a stretch and squash on this ball using a stretch modifier. Alright, so we've got our sphere and we've got our surface, and for this we can actually just look into say a front viewport. I'm going to hit G to turn off my grid, and since this is just a one-dimensional animation where I'm going to be bouncing in just one axis, then I can do all of my animation here from this one view. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. The way animation works in 3D Studio Max is you record animation by using the auto key or set key buttons, and whatever changes you make on whatever frame that the time slider is at that moment is what gets recorded on that object. Alright, so right now we're not in any type of animation mode. We could still set keyframes even though we're not in animation mode or set key mode, just by right clicking on the time slider. So we could set keyframes this way on whatever frame that we're on. Right now we're on frame 0, and we could set, or we could create a key on frame 0, position, rotation, and scale key just by clicking on this OK. But for this I want to go ahead and use the auto key feature. So turn on auto key and you see that your time bar turns red. That means you're in animation mode, and whatever changes you make will get animated. If I make any changes right now to the sphere, no keyframes get set because nothing has changed over time. So at frame 0 I can set this sphere wherever I want it to start. Alright, and so what we'll do is we want to say on frame, let's say frame 15, I want my ball to be at this position up in the air, and then at frame 30 I want it to be back at the same position it started. So that's one bounce. So we can record one bounce and then repeat that same animation over and over as long as nothing changes in that bounce. So instead of actually trying to move this sphere down and get it in the same exact position as where it started so that we have a seamless bouncing loop, I can actually select this first keyframe, which has recorded where my sphere was at this point, at the beginning point, and I can copy that keyframe just by selecting it, holding shift down, clicking, dragging that keyframe over to frame 30. And just like any other object that you want to copy, you select it, hold shift down, click and drag it over. So now I've just duplicated that keyframe over to frame 30. So now my sphere goes up on frame 15, stops, and goes back to the original position on frame 30. So now we've created just a simple animation. So you can see how this works. When I moved frame 15 and moved my object, it recorded two keyframes. One keyframe showing where the object was, and one keyframe showing where it is now. In order for animation to take place, you have to have a starting point and an ending point for every part of the animation. And 3D Studio Max fills in the gaps between those two keyframes, and that's what's called tweening in animation. So if we right click, select these keyframes and right click, you can see that all the information for the position of that object on this keyframe has been recorded in the X, Y, and Z axis. If we click on one of those X, Y, and Z axis, it opens up a keyframe tangent dialog box showing what time that animation is on. This allows us to toggle through each keyframe, this forward and backward button, and also we can go into an advanced way of looking at this keyframe. For now we'll just deal with simple. Time to show us what frame we're actually on. Value, which tells us at what value has been changed, or what value is current at that keyframe. Right now at frame 0 my value is 0.026, and that's in inches, and that references the pivot point of this object in relation to 0 of the world, 0, 0. And then what you have is tangents on this bottom section here, showing how the motion is recorded coming into the keyframe and going out of the keyframe. So we can actually change the way the motion react depending on how we have these tangents set coming in to the keyframe and going out of the keyframe. Right now, and in a default mode, these tangents are set for flat tangent types. As you can see, it tries to find a smooth interpolation between each keyframe. So coming into the tangent, it's gonna, or coming into the keyframe, it's going to have a smooth motion, and coming out of the keyframe it's going to keep a smooth motion. So you can see that's pretty smooth. There's no jerkiness. It keeps a pretty smooth motion coming into that keyframe and coming out of the keyframe. I'm going to go to keyframe 2 just so we can kind of show you what differences and what changes have been made over time. Now I'm looking at keyframe 2 and my time is at frame 15. The value has changed from 0.026 inches on keyframe 1 or on the first keyframe to 39.105 inches on the second keyframe at frame 15. If I click on this tangent button, I get a little fly out list that shows you all the different types of tangents that you can use. This tangent is a Bezier handle tangent, or what's considered a custom tangent, and you use this in conjunction with the curve editor, and this allows you to go in and actually tweak this animation curve using Bezier handles coming in and out of these keyframes. So you can notice that when I changed one tangent, it automatically changed the other. And it doesn't necessarily mean that both have to be the same. You can go in and change one and then change the other. Alright, this tangent here that looks like it's ramping up. Actually what this is a slow tangent, which means that it's going to slowly come into that keyframe. So it's actually going to slow down as it gets to that keyframe. Because of the way this bouncing ball is, it's going to slowly come into the keyframe anyways. So you know that you can't really tell the difference here. But we can also change this to fast, and you can see that coming from the first keyframe to the second keyframe, it actually starts speeding up until it gets to that second keyframe, which means that you can see in this curve it speeds up to that keyframe. So that's your fast tangent type. And this is a step tangent, and you can see it changes abruptly. So there's no change until it gets to the actual keyframe, and then it just jumps right up to the value. So it keeps the previous value of the previous keyframe constant until it gets to that next keyframe, and then it changes automatically to the value of that next keyframe. So it keeps the current value until it gets to that keyframe, and then it automatically changes to that updated value of that second keyframe, and then it keeps that value until it gets to the next keyframe, and then changes again. So it just makes a step pattern through those values. Alright, and then the next one is a smooth type of a tangent. So it makes the smoothest motion in and out of those keyframes. Or you can make combinations of these. You know, you can just smooth in and step out. So smooth in, and then it steps to the next keyframe. Okay, so you can have lots of different iterations of animation styles using all these different types of tangents, and this really makes your animation a little more powerful and a little more expressive, and it also saves a lot of time and saves a lot of keyframes. As you can see, you know, if I had to go in and keyframe all this movement of, you know, keeping it slow or fast in and out of these keyframes, I would have to add a lot more keyframes in here to control that motion. But now it's all built into those tangents. Alright, so for this, we're just going to continue with this custom type and leave it at that. We could, if we wanted to make it a little more interesting, we could do like a fast in and a slow out of this middle keyframe, but for now we'll just keep it at this custom tangent type, or flat tangent type. Alright, to make this a little easier to deal with, I'm going to shorten my keyframes that's shown in my time slider just to 30 frames. And there's a couple ways you can do this. You can either hold down Control Alt and then use your right mouse button to drag over this time bar. Or you could go over and right click on your play animation button and change your end time to 30. Say OK. Okay, so again, you could do that same thing by holding Control Alt button down and using your right mouse button. This is a real easy way to scale up and down your time bar. And if you wanted to add in negative time, you could Control Alt left mouse button, and that brings in your negative frames. Or if you wanted to scrub or pan your time frames over, you can use Control Alt and your middle mouse button and just pan through those frames. Okay, so we are at 0 to 15 to 30. So we've got a real simple animation I've got it, had it set to half speed there. But here at full speed, you can see there's just simple ball bouncing animation. And because we started and stopped at the same position, if we play that through and it loops, it's a seamless animation. To make this a little more interesting, let's go ahead and make it look like the ball is actually squashing down when it bounces and give it a little more weight. So with the ball selected, I'm going to go into my modify list and put a stretch modifier on it. Go back to my front viewport here. You can see if you just spin that stretch value up and down, you can see what effect it has on the ball. And because my pivot point is at the bottom of this sphere, the stretch gizmo in center, or the stretch center, is automatically at the bottom of that sphere, so it works well with making this ball look, or making this object look like it's being squashed by weight or gravity. Alright, so I'm going to go to frame 0, turn on my auto key, and here at frame 0 I'm actually going to give it a little bit of squash, because when I go through the animation and get back to frame 30 where this original position is going to be, you know, this is where I want my ball to come down and have some squash to it. So I'm going to go in and give it a little negative value of -0.1. And when I get here, I'm going to, let's say on frame 16, give it a little bit of a stretch. So I'm going to go up to 0.1, and this is all with the auto key turned on, so I'm recording all this spinner button animation. And you can see it creates these keyframes with all the stretch value information built into those keyframes. Also, you can go to the motion tab if you want to see these keyframe information, and whenever you get to a keyframe, you can see here in this key info basic rollout, all your keyframe information and tangents show up. So if you don't want to right click every time to see what that keyframe value is, you can just open up this motions tab and see it there in real time. Alright, so now I'm going to go over to frame 30 and do another squash down -0.1. Alright, let's play that and see what that looks like. Alright, I'm going to slow this down, and one way you can, this is a really good way to really look at your animation and slow it down so you can see exactly what's going on through each one of those frames. You can right click on your play button and bring up this time configuration dialog box, and here in the playback controls, the playback speed, you can change this to half time or quarter time speed, and this will actually slow down the way this animation plays in the viewport or in your scene. This doesn't have any effect on how the animation actually runs whenever you render this, but it does play it back in the viewport at a slower rate or a faster rate if you wanted to. Okay, so you can see here that my squashing isn't quite right. I want it to actually squash right after it bounces. So I can go in, and instead of it squashing right on the bounce, you want to actually squash right after it bounces. Okay, so I can actually go in and right click on these keyframes, and I want to move my stretch keyframe just past this frame. So I'm going to go in and say change my time to, let's say, frame 2. And right click on this one and I'm going to actually change this to a step. So no change is going to happen to that value until it gets to that keyframe. So I'm not going to get any squashing until it hits that value. Okay, so now you can see this is a little more realistic. Okay, so when the ball lands, it bounces and actually squashes a little bit. But it actually needs to, I feel like it needs to stay on that last frame just a little longer because it feels like it wants to snap. So we can actually go in and just move these keyframes back just a little. Maybe too much. I'm going to go back. And I'm going to go in and tweak this a little bit, move this stretching forward. Alright, so let's look at this full speed to get the full effect of it. There we go. Now that looks like a real animated ball. Let's look at it here. Alright, so there you go. There's your first bit of animation that you've created. So I hope this was helpful. We're going to get into a lot more advanced animation and a lot more animation tutorials in the intermediate section. So come back and learn some more animation. Our next video in this series is going to be on rendering. So check back and see how to do some rendering if we wanted to render this animation out. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.